Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Theodora Vischer, and I'm welcoming you to our talk with Tobias Rehberger. The reason why we are here is the wall installation Tobias created specifically for this wall and this room, and which was installed a couple of days ago. We are very happy and we are grateful to you and your team that this could happen. To celebrate this very special work, Tobias Rehberger agreed in a talk, and we decided that the subject for our conversation will be camouflage, camouflage as a technique and as a concept. Let me first introduce the artist only very briefly. He was born in 1966 in Esslingen, Germany. From 87 to 93, he studied with Tobias Beyeler and Martin Kippenberger in Frankfurt, Städelschule, where he has been professor of sculpture since 2001 and since a couple of years also deputy director. Rehberger's work has developed continuously over the last 20 years, moving between sculpture, installation, architecture, and design. He creates self-contained objects as well as site-specific designs and light installations for interior as well as exterior spaces. Many of his infrastructures and objects lend themselves not only for viewing by eye, but they actually directly address our sensory and behavioral routines as viewers, passerbys, and users. If one would have to characterize the main aspect and characteristic of his work, it is its in-between position, the moving of his work between sculpture, installation, architecture, art and life, outdoor and indoor. To achieve this position, Tobias Rehberger has developed formal and conceptual techniques. One of them is the camouflage. We all know the famous cafe you created for the Venice Biennial in 2009, and for which you were awarded the Golden Lion Award. Was this the first time you were using camouflage as a pattern?
In the work itself, it was the first time. I was interested in it as a concept and as a technique for a couple of years already, and actually the basic idea for the cafe bar in Venice I kind of already had in the drawer, and I was kind of waiting for an occasion to use that, but the idea was always that I wanted it not to be used in a typical art space, not in a gallery and not in a museum space, but in a kind of a functional context. It could have been a gas station or a supermarket or a bar or an office. And when Daniel Birnbaum, was the curator then for the biennial, asked me if I would be interested to do something with the cafeteria that they anyways had to rebuild and renovate because the pavilion, the former Italian pavilion, which is now the International Pavilion, had to be renovated anyways. So we also could do certain kind of architectural moves or differences. I had it kind of already, it was already there.
But why, what was your interest in camouflage?
Actually,
originally,
the original interest was not the camouflage in general that kind of developed out of that. It was the interest in a certain type of camouflage, which is called dazzle painting, and it was invented by actually British artists during the First World War to camouflage battleships. And the difference between the normal camouflage, you could say, is the normal camouflage tries to, and a little bit like what we have here also, that you have an object in the foreground that blinds into the background. So what we know from the normal camouflage of soldiers is always that they're not seen in a certain environment. And of course, that's why, you know, in the snow they have white outfits, and in the jungle they have these green patterns. But the dazzle is a way that an object kind of almost confuses itself. And the fact that it was made with these very strong graphic patterns, that's how I became interested in, because it seems to be paradox that you make something unseeable with very strong patterns, and that's how I got into it. So the camouflage technique that I used in the cafeteria in Venice was this dazzle camouflage technique.
But you were using it especially also to entertain people in the bar, or to confuse people in the cafe?
Confuse, I don't know. From the idea that's behind it is more a little bit that I'm interested in the idea of if visual art is visual, but then also it's not visual because it camouflages itself. So it's kind of made for not to see something, while the normal way, of course, art functions is that you look at something. And that has to do, I think, with the idea that, which I think I've always had in the work, and that's why a lot of work has also a kind of functional side to it, that art might be something which is not only to look at. And sometimes it's even something that is more interesting the moment you don't look at it. And this is just something that that as a general idea, and just out of an experience of myself, that I've always carried along since I don't know when. You know, like when I was a child, for example, I had always this idea that I would want to have a Van Gogh painting, but not to hang it on the wall and to look at it, but to sleep on it. You know, that was an idea that I had as a child already, that it must be fantastic if you could like just lie down on it and sleep. And this is what I felt, that it is a way of enjoying work, even though you don't look at it at that moment.
So you made, also this is a view of the interior, how it, was it, as it still looks more or less?
It's kind of, yeah, no, they have renovated already, I think 2 times a little bit. And now of course that's always the thing, you know, that when you're producing usable objects, that you have to be aware also that they change, you know, and it's always also a bit of a discrepancy then when things go in museum collections or also private collections and they get lent, that even that when I intend something to be a usable object, that this is kind of taken out of your hand. And of course it changes the moment somebody lives with it, and same with if you do art in public, you know, then the work has to be kind of internal, has to have a kind of internal readiness to change.
You made a franchise version of in Japan, of the same work.
Not the same, but you know, like.
Yeah, could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's like I always see it like you know, like if a painter does a certain series of paintings, you know, let's say kind of Picasso, pink period, blue period. So there's also always almost all of my work is also kind of developing in between a certain kind of series of work. And this was an invitation for a show about public art, actually, and it's on a tiny island called Settuchi, and it's an area where in Japan, which is a bit kind of, they call it the Mediterranean of Japan, because this is an area where a lot of people go have holidays, and already, I think 15, 20 years ago, they developed that concept that every second year, I think, or every third year, they invite 10 or 15 artists to do public work on a couple of these islands. And we found this old traditional Japanese house, which was abandoned and it was kind of falling apart, and we had this idea to renovate the house and make actually this is a restaurant. It's more a restaurant than a bar, and they only cook with the materials from the island, so it's only fish and the vegetables they grow themselves. And yeah, and I kind of did something relatively similar. What I did in Venice, and the idea, what I was saying before, that I was looking for a functional space to use this concept, has again to do with this idea that you come there not with the idea that you look at art, but it's there, and it's more that you kind of see it from the winkle of your eye, or that it's around you, and even if you concentrate it on something else, I think it does make a big impression, even if you don't look at it again.
And did it have the same kind of response in Japan than in Europe? I know that in Italy it is a big success still, and it's.
I mean, also this is still there. So if they would hate it, maybe it wouldn't be there anymore. So I mean, I have no reliable numbers or something, but
no, I don't mean about numbers, but is it culturally, is it something which is understood in the same way as in Europe, or?
I didn't have the feeling that it's different. I mean, it's always a bit hard to say, you know, with Japanese, what they say and what they think, and but I mean, maybe you could even say that somehow in Japan this a certain moment of playfulness is even maybe a little bit more appreciated than in our Western culture. So yeah, it seemed that they liked it, and that they find it funny and interesting, and but I couldn't say that there is a like major difference.
One last question regarding this group of works. The title is very special. What you love makes you crying. Does this have?
What you love can also make you cry. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit kind of tries to describe a little bit that something that you think you know works in a certain way could also suddenly change and makes you feel completely different about it. And this idea that the general idea of an artwork is that you look at it and that you stand in front of it, and that is a certain kind of confrontational situation that maybe if it's less confrontational and is more kind of general, could be something else and something that's just as enjoyable or even more.
It's very beautiful, the title, very poetic.
I'm trying, you know.
Let's skip first the next three and come back to those later. Dazzle ship.
Yeah, that was kind of a very special situation, because the ship that you see here is one of the 3 ships that still exist from the First World War. It's in London on the Thames, and it was actually painted in a dazzle camouflage.
Still?
No, it was in the First World War. Then it was a ship to destroy submarines. It's very strongly built, so the idea was actually that you drive through the submarine. That's how it is built. And it had this camouflage, and something, especially for a German, quite weird. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War, and somehow the British celebrated it or something. And so they invited me to re-dazzle this ship. And and it was a bit strange for me to deal with that, but in the end I thought maybe I could do it in a way so you see that 100 years have passed, and the kind of very heavy reason why it was camouflaged 100 years ago, try to make it into a bit of a funny and almost ironic way of doing that, and through that showing that 100 years have passed, and luckily we're not in a situation like 100 years ago. And that was what I was trying, and I mean, it's not so visible on this photo, but if you get closer, it has all these kind of tubes and almost a kind of a comic approach to it. And I thought that would kind of, like a little bit like Claes Oldenburg's gun, like kind of the knot in the, I don't know how you call it in English, but where the bullet comes out. And that was kind of the basic theme that I was trying to.
I mean, in a way, it's also a perfect match for this technique, because, as you mentioned before, historically it came up in connection with the First World War, and because not all of us know exactly, I can briefly explain how it came, as very often with such technical inventions it was in military context, and it was a scientist who introduced it, or to Winston Churchill in 1914, who was then the First Lord of Admiralty, with the intention of adopting it disruptive camouflage. And the idea was not, as he said, to hide the ships, but to paint them in such a way that their appearance was optically distorted, so that it was difficult for the submarines to calculate the course of the ship and to know from what angle to track. Yeah. And so then from 1917 on, apparently it was many ships were painted like that. And
also the Germans then stole the technique immediately, and I think even over 150 German battleships were painted in that manner.
So it is
But then it died out very early, I think already 1917 or something. I don't know, the radar or some kind of sonar thing was invented and it made it obsolete. So it was had only a very, very short period of time when it was actually used.
But was it, so it was a commission, this dazzle ship?
Yeah.
But didn't you already work with a project? Didn't you already make a project with a ship or a boat or something? Or that was something completely different?
That was quite different, but it's interesting that it was a kind of almost completely different project in terms of the starting concept of it. That was a friend of mine, also former student of mine, now quite famous artist, Dan Vo. His family escaped from Vietnam in the early 80s, and his father actually designed and built the ship they escaped with. And then there were, you know, the older ones of us know the term boat people. There was people who just jumped in their boat, and a little bit like what we have now in Europe, and they just drove out to the sea and waited that they will be picked up by another ship. And they were picked up by this Danish ship. That's why Dan grew up in Denmark. And I did a lot of work also where memory is a very important moment in the work. And I asked Dan's father if he could, from the memory, redraw the boat. And he did a couple of drawings, and then I asked Dan that he redraws the drawing of his father so they would look like it would be my work. And he chose to redraw them, and that's why it has also to do with camouflage. He redrew the drawings of his father in a kind of stealth. You know, stealth is this new camouflage technique since 30 years where you cannot see a plane or a ship in the radar. And he redesigned his father's ship in a stealth kind of manner. And that was this other boat project.
How would you describe the conceptual use of camouflage in dazzle ship compared to the group of coffees in Venice and Setti, Japan?
I think here this is more a work about the concept of dazzle, while in the spaces I have used it is more it's more the idea that the concept is used for something, used for what I said before, that it's kind of carrying this idea that it's not really there to look at. While this, as a kind of singled out object, is more kind of an example about what this technique means for itself.
Now let's come to the wall installation, or maybe first, also after Venice, this work, you also introduced camouflage in the museum, in your more autonomous works in the museum.
Yeah, you already say autonomous, well, because that's like
it's a kind
partly what it is about, of course. It's and it's right. It's about like what happens if the work in the museum disappears, kind of, and that's why it's kind of you could almost say classic sculptures in the way that they kind of these abstract objects, and then there's abstract painting behind it. But that's not exactly the same with the dazzle, because it's not confusing the object in itself. It's more the way most people understand camouflage, that an object blends into the background. And that again has to do with, you know, all these photos now are, of course, obviously made so it does blend in, but, and things do blend in, but actually more or less. And that has to do with, another thing I'm very interested in is perspectives, that like if you look at things from different perspectives, different things happen. And not only visually, I also mean it kind of metaphorically, and that's the interesting thing, you know, camouflage only works when you put yourself in the position that the thing can camouflage itself. And that's what these works are about. Because if you change the position, for example, of course, when you stand not in front of the sculpture and the painting, for example, if you stand only in front of the painting or only in front of the sculpture, it suddenly becomes an autonomous sculpture or an autonomous painting as any other painting or any other sculpture. But if you if you put yourself in the right position to not understand it, then you don't see it. And of course, that's also a part what happens here. That all the objects that are in the space, that if you look at them directly frontal, they also kind of disappear in the pattern of the background. While of course here it has a kind of another element also, which is that
it's quite a new type of work.
It's quite a new type.
Yeah.
The first ones I made were this January in Lisbon. Since then I have made maybe 6 or 8 of these. Yeah, that is, for example, that was one of the first ones in Lisbon. And most of them show or not show, depends on how you deal with it. How you call that? A genre of historic Japanese pawn drawings, you could say. It's called shunga, and I have used it in this with this kind of tile with this tile technique because. A process, a very normal process that everybody knows who has ever worked with a program called Photoshop. You can like turn an image down as much as you want, basically in the end into 1 pixel, but you can also do it, you know, for print you use a certain amount of pixels, for photo print you use another amount. And what I did is I turned it down so much that you almost cannot see an image anymore. It almost becomes an abstract image on the wall, but through different strategies of interpolishing, you could suddenly see the image clearer again. For example, interpolishing naturally happens when you're very far away from an object. What we usually would say, we don't see it properly, it's kind of blurry, that's what the brain does. Another possibility is if you half close your eyes, the brain also interpolishes and a lot of information that is actually not there is edited to the image you see. Another way of doing it is, for example, taking your camera from the telephone. So if you look at this wall with a telephone, you suddenly see much clearer the figures and what's going on. And yeah, and I've used that because I also think it's interesting. Again, it's a question of perspective and how you look at things. That now in our like advertisement society, naked body, porn in the internet, it became such a kind of normal thing, but to deal with it in a kind of way that everybody, publicly, everybody could decide himself how clear he looks at something. That was something that I was interested in.
It's, if I said before, it's a new type of work. That's all what you said now. You started with it in this year only, 2015.
No, not 19.
It's also twice again interesting historically, because in a way it's what you said, it's now the digital, also the computer-generated digital camouflage, which has also been invented by the military for uniforms not so long ago, and which we are, of course, very used to. But also this shunga, it's a centuries old tradition of erotic art, and it was publicly not legal, but since 1720 it was officially not legal, but it was geduldet.
Very common.
Very common. You could buy it, you could produce it, you could exchange it, etc. And only 1910 it was really forbidden. And only in, I find that interesting, only in 1994, a first uncensored publication of shunga art was published.
And it's also interesting that in Japan is one of the few countries where even if you buy a proper porn film, the main areas are still pixelated.
And I also, I'm saying this because these three groups of works we were now talking about are addressing also quite different backgrounds. Like this is now all the censorships going on everywhere. It's something we are sensitive. And is this just why it interested you at the moment, or why did you take up this?
I think it's not that I really thought about that, but I think sometimes, you know, like you get interested in things because they in the air, or it's not always a kind of completely rationalized decision. You know, I just like these. I mean, they're really beautiful. I mean, anyways, the you know, Japanese silk screens and wood prints, and I was always kind of fond of, and I also find it interesting. You know, sometimes they're very humorous. Also, you know, it's funny, and then sometimes I'm sure they were used the way people use porn nowadays. You know, and it's this kind of weird mix again. It seems that when something's unclear, I become interested somehow, you know, and of course, you know, also this idea that that it functions with the camera, that is this digital tool interpolishes in a way your brain does it too. I also had to find out. It was not, you know, that okay, I know how the camera works, and I know, and then I take the shunga, and it's more kind of like floating ideas, and then they come together, and suddenly they make sense, and then the moment they make sense, you make a work out of them.
So simple.
Yeah, it is simple, yes.
I find also very fascinating in this work conceptually that the main part, the most important part in a way of this work is on one hand there's 5 objects, or how many these are, and the USB stick on which are the data of the wallpaper.
Yeah.
So it's just that the wallpaper will be taken off and destroyed.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it's this stick and these objects.
Yeah, and the stick is just, you know, like, I mean, the general problem of wallpaper is always, and I have made not only wallpaper but wall painting, you know, is that people are somehow generally a little bit afraid of it, because they always think, you know, if I change the apartment, or if, you know, like we renovate the museum, or what happens, you know? So I think, I tried to develop a couple of different kind of strategies how to get around that. And one of them is that instead of having a kind of a certain kind of advice how to remake it, of course now you can put it on a stick, so the objects always, also in these other ones we've seen, or are seeing now, there's always a stick that comes with it, and when you want to redo it, or also, you know, it also gives you the possibility as the owner of the object, that if your wall is not exactly the size of the wall that I have used originally, you could crop it, you could yeah, do all kinds of things. You could print it on different material, and that's also something I like, that people have to somehow relate to it more than just hanging it on the wall.
Shall we ask if anybody has a question?
Yeah.
Does anybody want to know something about camouflage or Tobias Rehberger?
Or not.
Or not?
Everything very clear.
Why plants?
Why plants? It's not only plants, you know, it's the object itself is something. It's a vase, it's a bench, it's a pedestal, it's an ashtray. But I just like the moment when you have, you know, when you have that moment when something really blends in, like that suddenly these like real things are almost kind of floating in the air, that you could identify something, but you cannot really identify how it's going to be put there. And that's why. It's not why plants, but why I like that there is something else there which is not completely in line with the general aesthetics of the work.
And is camouflage still a valid method for you?
I mean, this is my latest work, so I guess, you know, I don't know what's happening, but at the moment I'm still, it still doesn't leave me alone, I could say.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.